So hello and welcome. Thank you everybody for joining. My name is Davy. I'm a software developer for UX. We are a software development company, a software consultancy company. We do various projects and product development, and we also work a lot with CAN design for the UX design part. So my talk is going to be about a developer's perspective on UX design and UX designers. So if only designers and developers spoke the same language. Now that does seem a bit harsh as I'm speaking it, but there are a lot of similarities, but there are definitely a lot of differences. And that's what I want to talk about in my little speech here. So I am developer. So basically I'm the type of person that writes code. I'm basically somebody who likes to build stuff. I try to break down complex problems into smaller chunks, making them manageable. And what I'm definitely not is that I'm not a designer. So just to illustrate that, if somebody was to ask me to design a website, it would probably end up looking like this. Basically, it would have lots of features because it would have stuff like infinite scrolling, which is something which is very popular. It would have really nice menu structures. It would have stuff like, let me see what I have here. It would have fancy tables, it would have sorting, it would have all kinds of fancy UI elements that you typically see in a modern web application. But this basically goes to show you that there is definitely a need for UX designers. So, the thing is that a developer typically perceives a web application as something that needs to be fast, focusing a lot on features, focusing on bug-free code, focusing on security, load balanced, and all other tech buzzwords that you can think of. Now, there's always a trade-off, obviously, as you're building an application. I mean, from a developer's perspective, it's fairly easy to say, okay, I want to make a web application that handles complex use cases in a technical way very fast. Now, this could result in an application like this, which for UX designers would probably be some kind of worst nightmare. Now, on the other hand, you could come up with fancy UX designs, but if you're unable to handle these complex use cases in a well-designed way, but very slowly, then you're also in a bit of a predicament. So there's always a trade-off between the two. Now, obviously, your target audience is also very important because, for example, if you're a nuclear power plant operator, you're probably going to be happy with an application like this. If you're a bank clerk or something, you're not going to be too happy. So the target audience is also very important when designing or building an application. Now, as a developer, what I think that I do is typically something like this. I mean, I'm focused a lot with technology, complicated things, lots of different things going on at the same time. Now, if you were to ask my wife or my friends what I do as a developer, it would probably end up looking like this. But in reality, it's basically focusing a lot on code. So as a developer, you're not always seeing the UX design. You're not always focusing that much on what you see on the front end. Even as a front-end developer, most of the time you're spending sitting behind the screen looking at source code, basically. And that's a bit of a problem in terms of how UX designers and developers can relate to each other. Now, what a designer typically does, or at least what I think a designer does, is he has a more of a holistic view of the entire application. So he can focus on the flows, he can focus on the screens, he can focus on the colors, on the interactions. And that's just a really big difference between the world of a developer and the world of a designer. And the language that a developer speaks and a designer is also something which is very different. Now, that's where we end up in some kind of Bermuda Triangle where sometimes things get lost. I mean, on the one hand, you have the developer that we already talked about that knows how to build something which is technically sound. We have the designer that knows how to make something look really good and make something very useful. And then we have a third actor, which is the customer, the one you're building the project for, who basically doesn't really know what he wants. And usually he thinks he knows what he wants, but we need to guide him through a process to make sure that he really knows what he wants or she wants. So we basically have to get everybody together, and that's the kind of projects that we typically do with CAN design. I mean, we get the customer in a room, we get the designers in a room, and we also get the technical people in a room. Because it's very important that these three actors communicate with each other and that we identify the constraints that we are working in. Because every actor within the story has its own set of constraints that we need to deal with. A customer, for example, will be primarily focused on time and budget. I mean, no matter how much they like a certain feature, if it's going to be too expensive, they're just going to drop it. Now, a developer will focus more on technical constraints. Will it be able to work? Will it be secure? Will it be able to handle the load, the projected load? And the designer, in fact, has very little constraints, especially in the beginning of a project, because there we can basically have these kind of UX exercises where everything is possible, where we design the most gorgeous screens and interactions. And it's only later within the process that things become a little bit more clearer and the constraints start to come up. So what we typically do with CAN design is that in the initial start of a project, we come up with something that we call an exploration sprint, which is basically a 2-week period where we just kind of brainstorm about an application. We don't take into account any technical constraints. We just think that everything is possible, and we have just a big list of stuff that we need to go to. And that can be stuff like technically related stuff, like, for example, how the data flows will look. Do we need to buy something off the shelf? Do we need to build something? What will the data model look like? But also, what will the goal of the application be? What will the goal of the platform be? What will the customer journeys be? And then once we have this big chunk of information, the idea is that we bring it down to a point which is manageable in terms of actually building out a solution. Because the problem is once you're in this zone here, basically everything is possible. And if you would have unlimited budget and unlimited time, it would be very nice to fulfill everything. But usually you need to end up here because you have to take into account all of these constraints. And what's also very important is that this is a continuous process. I mean, I've seen in many projects where the mistake is made that this is only done upfront in the beginning of the project. We sign off a document and then things are done. But that's actually a big pitfall to think that you only need a couple of design sessions at the start of a project, because especially during development, as soon as the customer starts to actually see something and can navigate to something using his computer or mobile phone, or when you're doing like QA testing or something, new insights are bound to pop up. And that's the point where you basically need to reiterate again and rethink certain design aspects of your solution. And it's very important at that point that you have your design team basically ready during that development testing phase to quickly react to these changing conditions that are bound to occur. Now, the customer also needs to be aware of what I called the shattered dreams effect, where what they design, which are basically the designers, and what we, developers, are able to build. I mean, sometimes there are technical constraints in what we can build. Sometimes the designer thinks that, okay, I'm going to create this fancy dashboard with all kinds of fancy KPIs, where all of a sudden the customer realizes that, okay, I don't have that data available at this moment. I won't be able to show this dashboard for one reason or another. And then you end up with building something which doesn't really 100% correspond to what was initially designed. And that's a constant discussion that you need to have with both the customer and the designers and the developers to keep everything in sync. Now, I also think it's very important for a UX designer to be very critical towards whatever the customer thinks he wants, because that's always an issue with the customer. The customer thinks he knows what he wants, but he actually doesn't know what he wants. So it's up to the designer as well to kind of flush these requirements out. He also needs to realize that whatever the customer seems to think he wants might not always correspond to what the end user wants. And I guess that's also something that the UX designer should focus on, the fact that we're building something for the user. We're not really building something for the customer. And it's also very important, like I said before, that these new insights start to reveal themselves through various design iterations which will be needed in a project. Another thing we also noticed is that customers tend to focus on happy flows. We design a certain interaction or we design a certain screen flow with the happy flow in mind, where nothing goes wrong. Where in reality, stuff goes wrong all of the time. I mean, sometimes there are errors occurring. Sometimes you're depending on a service which is not there. Sometimes you have performance bottlenecks. And then your UX needs to react accordingly. So that's also something which is very important that we need to take up in this design exercise. And we need that detailed UX design to tell developers what they need to do. Because in my experience, a developer is only productive if you give him a clear set of tasks that he or she needs to do. If you give him this fuzzy goal, then you will basically end up nowhere. It will cost you and the client a lot of money, and that's something that we don't want to do. And again, the communication is very important because all of the three parties need to listen to each other. The design should also happen with the end user in mind. And before everything else, I mean, we need to think about the actual user. And identifying the target audience is also very important related to that. If you're building an application, like I said before, for a nuclear power plant operator versus some kind of office clerk, it will make a huge difference in terms of how you design your UX. The design should also be self-explaining, and there should be no need for guiding the users through a certain design or providing lots of help within the application itself. And related to the unhappy flow, we also need to take really special attention to having a consistent design interface regarding, for example, confirmation boxes. How are we going to show success messages, error messages? How are we going to show spinners, loaders, all that type of stuff? And we also need to design with responsiveness in mind, because that's also something that's usually done as kind of an afterthought, because the customer might have this idea that, okay, of course it needs to run on a mobile application because, you know, everybody is doing responsive design. But I mean, you really need to think that stuff through, because not every application which is designed for a desktop will work on a mobile application. So there are definitely limitations with that. So that mobile first thought is something that needs to be taken up within the UX design exercise very early on, so that the developers are aware of that. And also, perhaps the most important for us then, is that we need to design with the developer in mind, because there's no point in coming up with a design that a developer will never be able to realize. So the designer needs to know, for example, which technology is being used by the developer, because that will help bridge the gap between the designer and the developer. If the designer already knows more or less what kind of language is being used, what kind of component libraries are available, what kind of icon libraries, what kind of theming capabilities within the technical frameworks are available, then that gap will shorten considerably, which is a very good thing. We also need to be able to get tools to the developers that make them more productive. And there's no point like the early days where a designer would come up with some kind of PDF or something, and then it's up to the developer to figure out what he needs to do with it. Currently, there are lots of modern tools right now which will really help the developer in aiding him to realize the design, because coming from a design to an actual working application is quite a big technical step. So every tool that we have to help us out there is really useful. And we also need to realize that things that look really simple initially can turn out to be very complex. For example, I remember a use case where we needed to draw up what seemed like a very simple table with a couple of filters, a couple of search boxes, but due to some technical constraints, because data was coming from various different sources, and there was a requirement that we needed to have infinite scrolling and we needed to have sorting, that it was virtually technically impossible to implement this use case. However, if we were to drop certain constraints, for example, there was a multi-select somewhere on a drop-down box, but that the customer probably didn't need to begin with, just by dropping that, it just makes the developer's work a lot more easy. And that's the kind of communication that we constantly need to have. So that's it for my talk. I don't know if somebody has any questions regarding that, or that's it. Yeah.
The biggest problem, if you call it problem, issue I have with developers is mostly that they don't
Okay.
So it's so often that I really try when I set up a project.
Yeah.
I'm freelance, by the way, so I'm not always working with the same developer
Yeah.
party. So
Yeah.
we don't, most of the times we don't know each other that well.
Yeah.
So I always include them in all the meetings in the beginning.
Yeah, yeah,
so
yeah.
they know I want to discuss. And once I give the, and I always tell them as well, it's like, okay, this is a starting point, start. The rest we will do while discussing.
Yeah.
While you develop, please come back to me because I know some stuff you cannot foresee.
Yeah. Yeah.
You need to develop and then you stumble upon
Yeah,
something.
definitely. Yeah.
And they never come back.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But I have to say, our CEO is sitting right behind you. So if you need a good developer party, we're
Should I repeat?
okay.
So,
I wonder if you have
No,
tips.
I think it's just
So-
it's creating
before
awareness.
you answer real fast, I'm just going to put it in the mic what you said, Petra. I'll try to paraphrase real fast. So Petra was saying that sometimes it can be frustrating for designers if developers don't communicate with us. And she tries to involve them very early on in the process and bring them to the table. And there's good conversations that happen at first, but then they kind of leave and don't come back, and there's no loop back. So what are the tips and tricks that you have to kind of keep that communication loop open? Is that what, did I get that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think most of the times. Yeah.
Be nice, that's a good one.
Yeah, I think most of the times, like I said in the beginning, designers get this really big role in the beginning of a project. They are very prominent in the beginning phase of the project. Then all of a sudden, everybody thinks that, okay, we flushed out all the requirements and everything is good. And then the designers kind of move to the background if you just let it be. And that's a bit of a problem that we see also with us. So that constant feedback loop is very important, and also informing the client that it's actually needed to bring the designers back on board so that awareness is created. Because some clients, for example, they have a certain budget, they have a development budget, they have a design budget, where in the beginning a lot of budget is spent on design, and then, you know, as development progresses, design becomes a little bit more of an afterthought. And that's something that we definitely need to avoid, and that can only be done by communicating that with the customer and also with the development team.
For the past 12 years or so, the web projects that I've done, as Davy said, oftentimes the UX UI budget is spent at the beginning, and then you're developers, and the company that we work for, we cannot contact you, the design company anymore, because you're usually an external company. The budget is spent, so you got to make do with what you have, and then that's when projects start falling down, because you have the designs of the screens that you got in the beginning, but then because we still communicate with the customer, new insights develop, new screens do need to be added, and we just kind of go on what we got in the beginning, and that's when the design starts to fall apart.
So the
one row in my offers, I always foresee one row like ping pong with the developers. So the client also sees it, and I always have that budget as well. And usually it's not that much you need. It's just like for those.
So the comment is that a lot of times by the time the design is handed over to developers, the design budget is spent. So there's not a lot of ability to follow up. And even if there is a new design budget that's implemented, it's usually for sort of the next phase. So the designers go into the next phase, and since they're kind of out of sync with the first one, by the time you reach there, it's kind of a bit of a mess, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And one thing that also helps in the way of working together is if you look at the allocation of work and budget spent, we like to advise the customer. In the beginning, it will be more or less more design versus development, but when the project goes on, 20% of your spent budget needs to go back to design during development.
Yeah.
Because otherwise it's going to be the thing where you build something and then, well, I cannot have the designer at hand because he's working on something else. I will talk to him next week, but then the project needs to go because the sprint needs to end in 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and it's easier to have that in the feedback loop. And another thing that also helps, if it's a very intense project or a couple of projects, join the daily stand-ups, because that's the easiest way to get feedback from any developer or even any designer to discuss. I'm stuck with this, or did I interpret this correctly? Do I need to do something else? And that always keeps the feedback loop very small.
Yeah.
So I think you should really organize it, because if you ask people, everything okay? Yes,
yeah, especially in our case also, I mean, yeah.
Attending stand-ups, making sure there's budget for follow-ups. These are good
And just
tricks.
also being honest with your client, because the client will never all of a sudden ask to get the designer back for some reason, because he doesn't even realize that there might be a design issue. And if the developers don't say it, or if the project manager doesn't say it, nobody will all of a sudden come in to get the designers back on board. But once you tell them that it's actually required, because we are stuck or whatever, it's going to be too difficult, or it's not going to be that good, then they usually listen, and then they get them back on board if they are available. Yeah.
So there's a quick question from YouTube, and it's to you or anyone in the room who's dealing with this, I suppose, but do you have specific rituals that you plan in, or is it kind of up to the individuals or on a case-by-case basis?
It's on a case-by-case basis, because I really like the notion of doing daily stand-up and everything, but certain customers don't really feel the need to have a daily stand-up, and they end up just joining it just for the sake of joining it, which is also not a good thing. Then it's just better to have like a more traditional weekly status update meeting or something, which can perhaps take a little bit longer. So it really depends on a case-by-case basis, what type of client that you have.
Does anyone have any best practices to share about that, where it worked really well?
I think it's important for developers that there's not too much discussion about something between the designer and the customer, because that's what they hate, and then they don't pay attention no longer.
So after something is handed off, you mean to kind of...
You need to go to the developer with a clear story, and that you and the customer are aligned, and then you can ask feedback. But as long as you are still having discussions, they just...
So making sure that there's a very clear alignment between the client and the designer before it's handed over.
Yeah, because a developer can only work productively if he really knows what to do, and if the thing that he's doing is actually also what the customer expects. Because we've seen in a lot of projects that sometimes, development gets ongoing because we make certain assumptions. We think that the client wants it in a certain way. Client sees it. It's not something that the client expected because he didn't know up front, and then you get this horrible loop where we need to redo things. It ends up costing everybody a lot of money, a lot of frustration, nobody's happy. So that's definitely something to avoid. Yeah.
So,
on projects during the kickoff meeting, discuss a definition of done for design, which is coincidentally also the definition of ready for development.
yeah, so Bavo just said that...
Lying to the customer, feedback goes still there. Then
So,
it's handoff, done.
So Bavo just said that it's important to define what the definition of done is for the design track, because that is the definition of start for the developers. Correct? Yeah, that's a good best practice to include. I have one other quick question from YouTube. And actually, I'm going to tie it into what we were just talking about. So there's designers who are really good client managers, making sure that we're both very aligned before it goes to development. That's an important skill. How does that compare to a designer who, say, has really good programming knowledge or even can do programming? Is there, what would be your preference? A mix of both? Which is more important?
I think it can help, but I don't really think it's mandatory. I think it's important to have also somebody from the development team who is senior enough that can go into certain discussions with the designer. I think for me, it's definitely not a requirement that a designer used to be a programmer or knows a little bit about programming. Actually, that's not that. I think when you have two senior profiles, a senior designer and a senior developer, usually they will be able to talk with one another and sort things out. So I think you just need to have a certain senior, I don't know how you say it in English, but seniority.
Seniority,
seniority,
yeah. That's interesting.
And one thing that helps for not senior levels is asking junior designers to also write epics and user stories.
Asking junior designers to write epics and user stories.
And deliver their designs together with the user stories attached to it.
That's
Why? Because it helps them interpret their designs and really trying to split them up in basic tasks that need to be done, both for themselves so that they know what exactly will happen when they click a button, but also it helps to brief the developer in that way precisely on how it needs to be built, and that really helps on getting to know each other's language and processes.
That's a really good tip, actually. So Nico just said that it's a good practice to have well, anyone, but especially junior designers, to write out their own user stories and get into the habit of being able to describe their designs in this more of like a very task, minute detail that developers need. And so over time, they kind of learn the language of developers, and yeah, that's a really good tip, actually.
Also, they greatly improve your testing flows if you have your user stories.
And it improves your testing flows as well, for sure.
Helps in UAT.
Yes. Any other questions? So you have a very provocative title, but you didn't give us any dirt. So you got to give us some sort of like mean girl gossip.
I'm not like that.
Come on, what do you
That's
talk
for
about?
the break.
What
For
do
the
you
break.
talk about behind our backs?
When the camera shuts down. after some beers.
All right, we're going to have to grill him on that during the break.
Exactly.
Thank you very much, Davy. It was a great talk.
Thank you.
Let's break until 8 o'clock, and we'll welcome Martin to the stage, and he's going to give us a listicle of 50 things that we need to know about UX. Awesome. Excellent. Okay, have a beer,
Thank you.
and we'll see you back.